Tickver believed in the 80s that German cinema was getting too self-obsessed, too self-aware of its own self, too pretentious, Wayne. We're talking Fassbender, we're talking Wim Wenders. Them filmmakers at a certain period became too pretentious for, our director of this film. And he made this film as it's classed as an experimental film.
Yes.
It's experimental, yet very populist. In a sense, it's very entertaining, it's very frenetic, it's very fast-moving, it's propelled forward at a constant pace. When you think of art cinema, this almost is the antithesis, even though it's diving into that criteria.
I was going to say, do you think this kind of skirts the line between the two? Because there's experimental films and then, like you say, your populist films. But for me, this feels like kind of on the line, a kind of blend of the two of them.
Almost the best of both worlds.
Yeah, exactly. Because you think of experimental films, they've been going on like since the dawn of cinema. Because if you think about it, when cinema started, technically, everything was experimental. Say something like A Trip to the Moon, because a lot of those techniques had never been done before. Man with a Movie Camera, again, so many techniques. There were things like freeze frames, slow motion, there was a lot of jump cuts, which was partly why it was poorly received at the time, but is now considered a masterpiece because it pioneered, didn't necessarily create, but it helped pioneer a lot of these techniques that we take for granted now.
Well, even possibly the 20s, I'm not exactly sure of the decade, Eisenstein kind of popularized the montage. And then you see the montage now and you think, the terrible montages of Rocky, they're terribly fun, but then it's part and parcel now of mainstream cinema.
It is, but it had to start somewhere.
Exactly.
Again, Battleship Potemkin as well.
Eisenstein.
Another fantastic film. Again, so many techniques you watch back, and it's because it's commonplace now. Any new trend is latched onto, it soon becomes commonplace and you get sick of it. It becomes cliche, but at one point it was revolutionary.
But Wayne, for this film specifically, because what is this film in a nutshell? It's the confluence of image and music. And experimental films, the experimental filmmaker of the 40s, 50s, 60s, etc., who comes to mind, Wayne, who is the biggest influence on this film, not necessarily directly, but indirectly through his mode of operation. I'm going to argue, and this is purely my opinion, Kenneth Anger. The director of Fireworks, the director of Scorpio Horizon. He was the first one, erroneously sometimes attached to Dennis Hopper and Easy Rider for bringing popular music into the score of a film. But Kenneth Anger was doing it in the 50s with Scorpio Horizon when he was bringing popular music into his short films and using that as the narrative structure rather than the orchestral score. So to me, Kenneth Anger's influence runs deep. Not just for this film, it runs deep for MTV, for example. Because MTV, you've got to remember, this is what a lot of people forget. Pre-Teen Mum, pre all music television that is not music television. When MTV first came about, it was using quick cuts. It was using fast cutting, for example. It was kind of using the tropes of the avant-garde in a very image literate way. So music videos of that time, and they still are, music videos are quite avant-garde in a sense, and this film is avant-garde, and I think it all ties back to Kenneth Anger. The cutting, the blending, the melding of music and image to create a whole.
And because MTV was a kind of mainstream pop culture breakthrough as well, and like you say, putting mainstream pop culture movie songs into movies in the soundtrack, it brings it to a modern audience. And it's not like experimental films just stopped, because even now in the last 30, 40 years, you have movies like Eraserhead. Right. You have David Lynch's Mulholland Drive. Another great one I really like, Memento.
Memento's
again,
really
because of Memento's interesting structure, someone it shares with Run, Lola, Run. Also, someone we've talked about before, Todd Haynes, who did Safe. Superstar, the Karen Carpenter story.
Okay. That's weird, Wayne.
It is strange. I mean, they don't all have to be good films, but
it's a good film. Shut up.
Yeah, it's the fact they're trying to do something different. And it's not like they're all underground things, because the French film, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie.
Is that Buñuel?
I think it was, yeah. One best foreign film. That's what made 90s cinemas so interesting. This is a way I've heard it put. Someone who once said, it was a YouTuber I follow, he said that he believed in the 90s studios were more willing to take risks on movies, because obviously we spoke about the 70s before the auteur-driven cinema. Then it got to the end of the 70s with movies like Heaven's Gate. Studios freaked out, like, yeah, we're not going to let those guys do
Fucking
what they want to
Camino.
do. Exactly. So we go through our 80s. Then you have this 90s revival, and you had such distinct movies made in the 90s. So many great films, like Tarantino movies. Luc Besson making Leon, one of my favorite films. Yeah, things like Human Traffic, which came at the end. Just very interesting films from a very interesting decade.
And I was thinking, have we seen a movement since the 90s that has revolutionized popular cinema as much? Because there is a distinct feel to this film that is very 90s.
Yeah.
When you look back on Pulp Fiction, it feels very 90s. When you watch Boogie Nights, it feels very 90s, even though it's playing with Altman's kind of ensemble, but it still feels very 90s.
Even though it was set in the 70s and the 80s.
And I was trying to think of what's kind of a current movement. Not necessarily it doesn't have to be lumped together, but I was thinking for a studio, A24 is kind of delving into a new kind of cinema. It's taken influences from the past, whether that be Scorsese, etc., and it's bringing a visual flair, visual style, a tempo, an aesthetic that is identifiably A24. And I think even though it's a studio, it's helming a new movement, which I think in another decade there's going to be a lot of imitators.
I'd go as far as to say right now A24 is maybe my favourite movie studio right now. Because this film plays around with a lot of themes. One of the keys, I'd say, it plays around with time, because we have essentially 3 scenarios. The film is divided into 3 scenarios. There's a lot of repetition going on. It's kind of like...
Important.
Kind of like if you've seen the movie The Last Duel. Anyone who's seen that, it's the same story but told from like 3 different perspectives. It's not an entirely new concept. In fact, I was thinking one movie in the 90s that did something like this, you're not going to believe this, Wayne's World.
Wayne's World? I saw Wayne's World. I think everybody saw Wayne's World.
At the end of the film, it's kind of a sad ending. Okay, let's go back and do it happy. Let's go back and do it even happier, happier kind of thing. So playing fast and loose with time, repetition, changing scenarios. Right. Another film, critically acclaimed film, Rashomon.
Of course.
Even though Rashomon was more about, I'd say, honesty and subjectivity, but it was the same thing. It was the same scenario playing out several times, but playing out differently each time.
I've got another theory here, Wayne. I'm going to get more esoteric.
Ooh.
This film,
yes.
Okay, you mentioned the crux of this film, the driving force of this film is to gather 100,000 Deutschmarks, right? To me, this film, more than being influenced by other films like Rashomon, whatever, video games.
Yes, absolutely.
To me, this was almost a live-action video game where we're replaying and repeating the same stage, the same level of the video game. And it's her mission, Lola's, to reach the end of this game. And by dying through each act, as we mentioned, she is learning from a mistake to further herself along the same level on her next attempt. It is very much video game-like, and I would even go further than just that part. When Lola's running to meet Marnie to try and get this 100,000, she often bumps into people.
Yes.
When she comes into contact with these people, we get a flashback or a flash forward or a flash through, whatever you want to call it, of their entire existence going forward. And this reminded me of video games and how when you're a protagonist in a video game, it's very solipsistic. The only thing that exists is the character and what they interact with. And it almost felt like the world around Lola or Maddie, whoever was the focus at that moment, their world was being rendered, and that's all they knew. That was the computer rendering the scene. And that's what I thought of this film. It's very video game-like. The only information we know is from them. We are only rendered what we see. I don't think a world exists where they aren't.
No, it's like they're almost kind of like in a microcosm.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you get that? Did you?
I absolutely. I even mentioned it in my synopsis. The interesting thing is, what happens is it kind of puts Lola in a position where she is a player rather than a character. Because when we're playing a video game, the character dies over and over again. It's trial and error.
Right.
Because obviously the character doesn't know anything. We learn it because we are playing the game. But here, Lola is the player. She fails at something, she goes back, she gets to do it again, she gets to make changes. In a way, it almost makes the movie kind of more interactive, because when you think 90s, you had your PlayStation coming out, how mainstream games were becoming, how much they were advancing. So yeah, I think in a way, that being the kind of central conceit of the film, that does place it in the 90s.
Do you think Tikver was influenced by video games?
I think he was.
Because it's very a digital film in a sense. You have a driving techno beat throughout the entire
persistent
film,
techno
which
beat
you
throughout.
could class as digital type music.
Exactly. You have cartoon segments as well,
animation,
which reminded me of kind of like the Saturday morning cartoons or cartoons you would watch in the morning before you went off to school, kind of intercut, spliced in.
Now, here, am I going too far left field? Does Lola remind you, visually at least, of Lara Croft?
Video game character, 90s. Yes, does remind me of Lara Croft. The idea of being the action hero. And also, because Lara Croft, was she not hailed as a feminist icon at the time? And the actor who played Manny, he said of this film, he said, "For me, that's the genius of Lola. It's a feminist story. 90s action movies were about the cool guy with a deep voice who saves the girl. This was one of the first features where you had a woman, a regular woman, not a 6-foot Amazonian with diamond triceps, who's just running to help her boyfriend. And she's got red hair." Actually puts that on the end.
But the red hair is important, Wayne.
The red hair is very important.
Which I'll mention in a minute. But what I wanted to mention, we're talking about theme, Wayne. We talk about analysis. What is the first thing said in this film by an unshown narrator? Man, probably the most mysterious species on our planet, a mystery of unanswered questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? How do we know? What we think we know. Why do we believe anything at countless questions in search of an answer that will give rise to a new question, and the next answer will rise to the next question, and so on and so on. But in the end, isn't it always the same question and always the same answers? So even there in this narration, and did you know, just before we move on, that narration is spoken by a popular fairy tale narrator in Germany, who everybody who watched this film who were German, I had no idea at the time, knew his voice automatically because he was that famous.
No, I didn't know that at all.
No.
That feels to me like it's establishing a kind of overlord thing. Again,
overlord.
like a player of a video game, because as the player, you see everything. You watch over everything.
Great cue there, Wayne, because what is one of the themes of this film is predetermination. And you said an overlord. So, if we're discussing this, predetermination, let's call it that, do we have free will in this film?